I pulled into my driveway and stopped dead. My carefully dug runoff trench, the one that had saved my barn through decades of storms, was gone filled with gravel, like someone had buried it on purpose. Karen Whitmore, HOA president, strutted up, clipboard in hand, smiling like she'd won some petty war. "We're just improving the landscape," she said. "Improving? The water doesn't care about beauty." I stared at the neat little squares, my jaw tight. They say peace is just the silence between storms. But for me, peace wasn't a luxury, it was a routine. I woke before sunrise, fed the chickens, walked the fence line, and checked the runoff trench beside my barn. That modest depression in the earth had been there longer than the houses, maybe longer than the subdivision itself. It wasn't much to look at, but it did its job. When rain fell, it guided water from the hills above Ridgeview Meadows, down past my property, and out toward the eastern retention basin. Like veins beneath skin, you only notice it when it clogs. I'm Daniel Harper, 57, retired engineer, widower, a man whose life revolves around soil, stone, and the rhythms of land. After retiring from the Corps, I bought this property at the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I built a life here, raised 2 kids before they went off to college. When Linda passed, the barn became more than a building. It became a rhythm, an anchor, a way to keep one foot tethered to the world I understood. For years, the HOA was harmless. Newsletters came and went. Trim your hedges, remove holiday lights, yada yada. Nothing I couldn't ignore. But over time, the board shifted. New faces, younger and ambitious, more interested in control than community. And at the center of it all was Karen Whitmore. She carried a permanent frown and a clipboard like it was a badge of honor, striding through the neighborhood like she owned the land itself. The first hints of trouble came subtly: surveys, mandatory visual reviews, requests for photos of my yard, my barn, my fence, then letters. Thin, cream-colored envelopes with HOA emblems in the corner, formal and threatening. Unauthorized trench, visually disruptive, subject to correction. My jaw tightened each time I read one. That trench had been on the original development blueprints. It was functional, critical, and most importantly, safe. Still, I tried to reason with them. Letters, photos, maps, even citations from city drainage reports. No response. Weeks later, I came home to find contractors digging, my trench half filled with gravel, paving stones stacked neatly beside it. Karen Whitmore herself was there, inspecting the work like she'd conquered a small kingdom. "We're modernizing," she said. I told her it wasn't meant to look pretty. It was meant to move water. She smiled that patronizing smile, the kind people give to veterans when they think we're fragile. And just like that, my peace evaporated. I didn't shout. I didn't storm off. I knelt beside the ruined trench, ran my fingers through the wet, packed earth, and listened. The faint trickle of water from the hillside above whispered its warning. Seasons didn't care about HOA rules or decorative landscaping. The land remembered. It always remembered. By that point, I understood one thing. This wasn't just about me. It was about a principle about listening to the land, respecting what had been there long before anyone with a clipboard decided what beauty meant. And if I didn't act, the consequences wouldn't just be my problem. They would be the neighborhood's. Weeks passed, but the trench didn't care about HOA letters, surveys, or their petty rules. I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, satellite images, drone footage. I became a one-man audit of Ridgeview Meadows' stormwater history. But the HOA didn't respond with reason. They responded with insistence, bureaucracy, and finally, complete disregard. The second letter arrived on a gray Thursday morning, heavier this time, threatening fines and disciplinary procedures for my refusal to cooperate. I read it 3 times, staring at the embossed seal as if it might blink back at me and offer reason. No, just rules, rules, rules. Threats without understanding, threats without expertise. I'd served 30 years in the Corps of Engineers. I knew water, I knew slopes, I knew consequences. Karen Whitmore knew none of it. Then came the contractors. I had just returned from the feed store when I saw the skid loader parked along the edge of my property. My trench, my careful work, was half buried beneath gravel. 2 young men stood by, shrugging. Just following HOA instructions, one said, like it explained everything. I didn't argue. I just watched. Karen appeared shortly after, wedge heels crunching against wet gravel. "We're upgrading the landscape," she said, tilting her head like a cat, clipboard tucked under her arm. It'll look much nicer. My jaw clenched. It moves water, I said. It prevents flooding. She smiled that same patronizing smile. Perhaps it's time we modernize a little. And, that night, rain tapped lightly on the barn roof, almost like a warning. I sat under the single hanging bulb, staring at the floorboards, listening to the rhythm outside the rhythm that Karen and her board had just tried to silence. I knew what would happen. Water doesn't negotiate. It doesn't check permits. It doesn't care about committees. Days later, the consequences began to reveal themselves. The snowmelt and spring rains pooled where the trench had once guided it. Small puddles formed at first, then widened. The water looked for lower ground. It carved new paths around the gravel overlay, washing away mulch and soil near the clubhouse. I walked the perimeter, boots sinking into saturated earth, flashlight in hand, watching nature's logic assert itself. I tried reasoning one last time. I went to the city engineering office, squarely presenting my case to Greg Myers, an old colleague who understood both code and common sense. He reviewed topographic data, overlays of the floodplain, and shook his head. They filled a registered runoff channel, he said. This isn't just ignorant, it's reckless. I nodded slowly, no words needed. I had warned them. I documented everything, further videos of water pooling, the beginnings of erosion, evidence of contractors acting without permits. I even attended the next HOA meeting. I spoke calmly, citing city codes, subdivision blueprints, and my own military-grade trench plans. Karen rolled her eyes, dismissing me in front of the room. Progress, not paranoia, she said. But the trickle of doubt had begun. Some neighbors glanced around, uneasy. They had no idea the danger lurking beneath manicured gravel. A week later, the first real storm arrived. Not a downpour, but a steady, insistent rain that saturated the ground. The water pooled behind the barn, then crept sideways, seeking paths blocked by the new gravel and ornamental shrubs. I watched from the doorway, heart pounding, knowing exactly where the water would go. And I wasn't wrong. It carved a channel along the back edge of the clubhouse property, destabilizing soil that had never been disturbed. By nightfall, the first damage became evident. Mulch beds slumping, decorative poles tilting, water collecting dangerously near foundations. I ran to check sandbag placements, assess slopes, and ensure the barn itself remained safe. The rest of the neighborhood remained oblivious. Karen Whitmore paced near the clubhouse, phone glued to her ear, barked instructions she didn't fully understand. I said nothing. Nature was about to teach a lesson she couldn't ignore. The water found its path with stubborn persistence. Rivulets carved through mulch beds, flowed over compacted gravel, and pooled in the very spaces Karen had insisted would look nicer. It always remembered. By that point, I understood one thing. This wasn't just about me. It was about a principle about listening to the land, respecting what had been there long before anyone with a clipboard decided what beauty meant. And if I didn't act, the consequences wouldn't just be my problem. They would be the neighborhood's. Weeks passed, but the trench didn't care about HOA letters, surveys, or their petty rules. I documented everything. I stayed out in the rain, boots muddy, jacket soaked, flashlight in hand, guiding water where I could, preparing for what I knew might come. And through it all, the HOA remained blind to the cause. Their confidence in rules over reason had set the stage for disaster. I watched Karen Whitmore argue over phone calls, flinch at the first cracks, yet still failing to see that their oversight was not a glitch, it was the catalyst. By the time the storm eased, the warning had become undeniable. The clubhouse grounds were saturated, erosion had begun, water had found new paths, and all the while, I stood by my barn, heart steady, knowing the land had remembered, the trench had been right, and the HOA had ignored the truth at their peril. The storm came quietly at first, a steady, insistent drizzle that soaked the ground, then grew heavier as the afternoon wore on. By evening, the trench beside my barn, the one Karen Whitmore and her board had filled in, was overwhelmed. Water pooled in unnatural hollows, sloshed along gravel paths, and began carving new channels where mulch beds and ornamental shrubs had been planted. I stood at the barn door, boots sinking into the saturated soil, flashlight in hand, heart hammering. I had seen this before. Nature always finds its way. Karen appeared shortly after, drenched and wide-eyed, phone clutched in her hand. Her pink rain boots squelched into the mud, SUV parked dangerously close to the newly rerouted runoff. I didn't speak. The hillside itself seemed to answer. A chunk of earth began sliding slowly toward the clubhouse, carrying mulch, topsoil, and a decorative light pole like driftwood in a river. Within minutes, the patio cracked, the foundations shuddered, and water pooled in spots it had never reached before. I ran toward the clubhouse, pounding on the glass doors. Karen flung them open, keys in hand, bewildered. "Move your car!" I yelled. She complied, finally understanding the gravity of what she'd ignored. For hours, neighbors began to arrive, some hesitant, some curious. Estelle Garcia brought shovels. Paul Lindsley lugged sandbags. Even Jared, the teen with headphones always glued to his ears, showed up with a spade. Together, we redirected water, reinforced weak soil, and tried to protect what we could. The HOA board, once so confident in rules and appearances, stood frozen in mud-streaked silence. Pride had left them exposed, powerless against the consequences of their arrogance. By morning, the extent of the damage was undeniable. The clubhouse's rear patio had partially collapsed, the parking lot was half submerged in silt, and mulch beds and shrubs had been swept away. Windows were shattered, furniture displaced, and the espresso bar looked like a war zone. Karen Whitmore stood on the edge of the parking lot, soaked, eyes wide with recognition. For the first time, she understood. City officials arrived shortly after. Greg Myers, clipboard in hand, surveyed the chaos, muttering curses under his breath. Engineers took soil samples, photographed every failing slope, and launched drones to capture aerial footage. After reviewing the evidence, including my own detailed documentation, maps, and time-stamped photographs, they confirmed what I had been saying for months. The HOA had altered a registered drainage channel without permits, violating municipal and state stormwater regulations, and had directly contributed to property damage and public risk. I handed over my compiled documentation calmly, letting the facts speak. No arguments, no gloating. The board could no longer deny responsibility. The city threatened fines, legal action, and required that remediation be conducted under my supervision. Karen Whitmore, stripped of her usual confidence, finally admitted, We need your help." I nodded once. This wasn't forgiveness, it was practical guidance, because the land, and the people, deserved it. I watched as residents began to awaken. Conversations replaced whispered complaints. Questions replaced silence. They asked how to protect their own homes, how to respect the natural flow of water. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like a community rather than a collection of lawns and rules. The storm hadn't just revealed physical damage, it had exposed ignorance, pride, and the real consequences of pretending to understand what you don't. As I returned to my barn that night, rain still falling in a soft, relentless drizzle, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The land had delivered justice in its own time. The HOA had been held accountable, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. Nature doesn't negotiate, doesn't plead, and doesn't forget. It had reminded everyone, Karen included, that some truths are impossible to ignore. The morning after the storm was eerily silent. No birdsong, no dripping eaves, just the heavy hush of mud and water settling into what it had carved. From my porch, I could see the full extent of the clubhouse's surrender. The roof partially submerged in silt, shattered windows, the patio collapsed like a wet sheet of paper. Karen Whitmore and the rest of the HOA board stood nearby, coated in mud, staring at the ruin. Not a word was spoken. Their silence was louder than any argument. The city moved quickly. Greg Myers arrived mid-morning with engineers, soil samples, and drones, confirming the full scope of the violations. Ridgeview Meadows had been endangered by the HOA's reckless interference. Fines were levied, lawsuits initiated, and the board was barred from holding office for 5 years. But the most important change wasn't legal, it was cultural. Residents who had ignored the warnings now came to me with questions. Where should runoff go? How do we protect our yards? How do we respect the land? I became the unofficial stormwater consultant, walking yards, sketching plans, and explaining the logic of slopes, trenches, and soil absorption. Even Karen Whitmore showed up, notebook in hand, listening more than speaking. She didn't ask for forgiveness, she asked for understanding. Slowly, I began teaching her, then others, about how water moves, why the trench mattered, and what happens when human arrogance ignores natural law. We rebuilt the trench beside my barn, wider and deeper this time, lined with rocks and reinforced with a buffer zone. We regraded the slope behind the clubhouse, turning a mudslide-prone hill into a terrace rain garden. Neighbors planted native vegetation, added rain barrels, and cleared blocked runoff channels. The land, once abused by rules and aesthetics, began to breathe again. Over the next weeks, the community shifted. Residents who had been passive or skeptical became active participants. Paul Lindsley installed proper drainage in his backyard. Estelle Garcia planted pollinator gardens along secondary runoff paths. Jared, the college kid who always had headphones in, built a GIS model of Ridgeview Meadows stormwater paths. Even Karen continued learning, taking soil science courses online, photographing runoff after storms, and quietly advising neighbors. Pride had been replaced with curiosity, ignorance with understanding. The HOA as it had existed was dissolved. In its place, a rotating community council was formed, composed of residents with real expertise. Decisions were transparent, meetings open, and nobody imposed rules without reasoning. The neighborhood had learned to listen not to a clipboard, not to bylaws, but to the land itself. One evening, I found Karen standing near the terrace rain garden, watching the water flow through stone channels and native grasses. She didn't notice me at first. When she did, she smiled faintly. "I guess I had to lose everything before I could listen," she said. I nodded. That's how nature works. It whispers first, then it takes. She extended her hand. I shook it. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but recognition. Months later, Ridgeview Meadows became a model for community resilience. The city recognized our efforts with a plaque for sustainable stormwater management. I hung it in the barn, not for pride, but as a reminder that listening to the land isn't optional, it's survival. Children called my trench the mini river, and I didn't mind. They learned where to step when rains came. Elderly neighbors checked barrels and cleared small channels themselves. Culture, not rules, had replaced fear. I still wake before sunrise. I still walk the fence line and inspect the trench. The barn stands, the runoff flows, and the neighborhood, once trapped in its obsession with perfection, now respects the land. The rain comes, as it always does, and I watch it flow where it belongs, guided and contained, not fought or ignored. And in that moment, with the barn behind me, the grass wet under my boots, and the gentle sound of water moving through the stone-lined trench, I finally feel peace. Not the absence of storms, but the certainty that when you stand your ground, when you respect what you know matters, the land and life itself will remember.